Welcome to Accommodate This. My name is David, and I'm a late diagnosed autistic adult. I make content about being autistic and the neurodivergent experience, so if that's something you're interested in, please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos. The 2024 presidential election is over, and Donald Trump is the president-elect. At several points leading up to the election, Trump said he would place Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at the head of the health department and would let him go wild. He even referred to RFK as the health czar. So in this video, I'm going to explore what that might mean for the future of the health department and some of the impacts it may have on autism acceptance. This video is a bit different than my others, but I hope you'll stick around to hear what I have to say. And now that you know why we're here, let's get into the topic for this video: HHS and RFK Jr. The Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS for short, is a vast department in charge of overseeing a wide array of public health issues. And before they changed their name in 1979, they were called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and that will give you some idea of their scope. Since then, all the education aspects were split into their own Department of Education. But they're still responsible for health and welfare. This includes responding to outbreaks, handling toxic substances and diseases, food and drugs, health insurance, and ensuring people have access to care, among many other things. And Trump, RFK Jr., and others have mentioned the CDC, FDA, HHS, and the NIH, but if you're like most Americans, you probably don't even have any idea how these agencies fit together or what other offices, administrations, and agencies are considered part of HHS. So to start, here's a list of all the agencies within the HHS. These agencies and offices are at the cabinet level of the executive branch of the federal government, so they hold a lot of power and are highly regulated. As you saw, they cover a wide range of responsibilities, though they share a common goal of promoting the health and well-being of the general public. You're probably most familiar with the three of those agencies that I mentioned earlier: the NIH, the FDA, and CDC. But allow me a moment to briefly explain their roles. So, the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, are responsible for conducting and funding basic and applied biomedical and behavioral research. Think of them as the medical scientists figuring out how the human body works and what causes diseases, and they're the ones creating medications and vaccines to treat those diseases. Then there's the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, and they ensure the safety of drugs, vaccines, and medical devices and other health products stemming from biomedical research. So think of them as the ones testing to make sure that the medicines and vaccines created by the NIH are safe and effective, like a checks and balances kind of thing. And finally, there's the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, and they engage in health promotion, disease prevention, injury and disability, and preparedness for new health threats. So think of them as the strategists and communicators that are getting the message out about diseases and the right treatments. So to recap, you have the researchers and medicine creators in the NIH, the safety inspectors making sure those medicines are safe in the FDA, and the advertisers promoting the safe use of those treatments in the CDC. All three of these agencies fall under the umbrella of the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. So when Donald Trump said he would place Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at the head of the health department, he's essentially granting RFK Jr. power over these offices, as well as all the other offices that I showed you in the list before. It's a lot of responsibility, and only a fool would put someone without any medical knowledge or experience at the head of it, right? Well, RFK doesn't have any medical credentials. In fact, he's been known to have a lot of crazy ideas about health-related issues. For example, he's been a very vocal skeptic of vaccines, stating there's no vaccine that is safe and effective, and spreading the thoroughly debunked claim that vaccines cause autism. And regardless of your opinions on the matter, just think about that for a second. This guy with no medical background claims that the hundreds of scientists at the NIH knowingly created harmful vaccines, and that the hundreds of professionals at the FDA willfully neglected their responsibility to properly test them, and that the hundreds of experts at the CDC knowingly promoted unsafe treatments to the public, and that they did it over and over again for decades as part of some conspiracy. It doesn't make sense, does it? And that's because all those things would have to be true if his claim was true. And spoiler alert, they're not. These are large agencies with tons of staff, governed by lots of regulation and oversight. They are using scientific methods to discover safe and reliable treatments that work with our biology. And these agencies have been very vocal and transparent about their processes and the efficacy and risks around vaccines, which are responsible for eradicating smallpox, nearly eradicating rubella and polio, and drastically reducing cases of measles, malaria, cervical cancer, flu, COVID, among others. The nearly eradicated ones are at risk of returning because of vaccine deniers. We know the dangers of these diseases, and we know the vaccines are incredibly effective at fighting them. So when vaccine deniers like RFK Jr. spread these unfounded conspiracy theories, they are working under a lot of assumptions and using a false equivalency to make it seem like the treatment is just as bad, if not worse, than the diseases themselves. And spreading that kind of misinformation is completely irresponsible and dangerous. On Election Day, November 6, 2024, RFK Jr. put out a tweet explaining what Trump wanted him to do for the health department. Here's what he tweeted. President Trump has asked me to do 3 things. 1. Clean up the corruption in our government health agencies. What corruption is he talking about? Most likely he's talking about what is suggested in Project 2025. So I'll get to that in a bit. Number 2. Return those agencies to their rich tradition of gold standard evidence-based science. And yet, during the height of COVID, he and Trump pushed the use of hydrochloroquine, despite what scientists were saying about the dangers of doing so. Mistakes like that are not only less effective than well-developed treatments, but they can also cause a lot of harm. And that's more likely to weaken our health infrastructure, not strengthen it. Not to mention, it erodes the trust of these scientists and vaccines that they're making, leading to more outbreaks of vaccine-preventable infections. Number 3, make America healthy again by ending the chronic disease epidemic. RFK Jr. has already taken steps against this, saying he wants to remove fluoride from the water supply, which would significantly impact oral health, a leading cause of heart disease. Fluoride has been scientifically proven to strengthen tooth enamel, prevent tooth decay, and reduce cavities. And tooth decay has been directly linked to heart disease and to infections that can spread to the rest of the body. So it may seem like a non-issue to many people because we aren't seeing any rampant outbreaks of tooth decay. But that's not because the fluoride isn't needed. It's because the fluoride is working. Fluoride has been in our water sources for over 75 years. It's not only a naturally occurring mineral, but we have increased it to bring it up to the levels that will be effective at strengthening our teeth. And studies show it has led to preventing at least 25% of tooth decay in children and adults ever since. And this is separate from the effects of fluoride that is found in your toothpaste. So implying the issues are just general hysteria is a denial of reality and evidence-based science. When asked about his decision to have RFK Jr. head the health department, Trump said, "I'm going to let him go wild on health. I'm going to let him go wild on the food. I'm going to let him go wild on medicines. The only thing I don't think I'm going to let him even get near is the liquid gold that we have under our feet." What is one man with no medical experience or knowledge going to do that experts and scientists have failed to do? Well, that's where Project 2025 comes in. Project 2025, also known as 2025 Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise, is a more than 900 pages of conservative propaganda and strategies for establishing a Christian nation. It was created by the Heritage Foundation, which is the same Christian-based foundation responsible for choosing the 3 Trump-appointed Supreme Court judges, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, all of whom said under oath that they would not eliminate Roe v. Wade, only to turn around and do just that. So Project 2025 goes into great detail about what the next administration needs to do regarding the Department of Health, using incredibly biased language in some places. On pages 283, 284, and 452, they claim that the CDC and NIH are the most incompetent and arrogant agencies in federal government. And they blame them and President Biden for the mishandling of COVID and absolve Trump for any wrongdoing. They also recommend splitting the CDC into 2 separate agencies, but then later on suggest decommissioning the CDC and NIH on page 462. And on page 457, they suggest the NIH and FDA should promote efficacy trials, which they already do. And what's the reason behind all of this? It comes down to another conspiracy theory. The Heritage Foundation is very much against abortions, and they press their position several times throughout the document. But the most despicable part of it all is they'll throw anyone under the bus to get their point across. On page 455, they mention that the NIH uses fetal tissues to create vaccines, which is true, but not nearly as bad as it sounds. Many vaccines can only grow within a cell. Most human cells die after dividing a certain number of times, usually around 50. And this limit is known as the Hayflick limit. However, fetal cells have not divided nearly as many times as, say, adult cells. So cells that have divided fewer times can be used longer. But it's understandable that people would express hesitation of using fetal cells, and if doctors were actually harvesting tissue from newly aborted fetuses, I'd say you have every right to be concerned. However, they've been using the cells from the same 3 fetuses for decades. 2 were obtained from electively terminated pregnancies in the 1960s and 1 in 1985. What they do is they put a few cells in a container and provide nutrients that enable continued growth. And as they grow and divide, they fill up the container with new cells, and this process can be repeated exponentially. They can even freeze the cells for long-term storage, thawing them decades later and freezing any cells that replicate from the thawed cells. And scientists have literally repeated this process thousands of times with the same 3 specimens for decades. They don't have a need to harvest from any other fetuses. And not only are those fetuses completely unviable for becoming fully functional human beings, it would be a waste to not use them. So, while the viruses used to create the vaccine require human cells to grow in, the vaccines themselves do not contain any fetal cells. Any tissues besides the vaccine are filtered out, so there's no risk of infecting someone or injecting them with a fetal cell. And yet, the Heritage Foundation uses scare tactics to make it sound like doctors are convincing women to kill their babies so we can harvest their tissues and inject them into people in the form of vaccines. This shows that they are simply pushing their religiously motivated agenda. Although RFK Jr. has been known to embrace vaccine misinformation, he recently said he's not going to take anyone's vaccines away. Still, he continues to make false claims about COVID vaccines and promotes false facts about vaccines and autism, even calling autism an epidemic. Both he and Trump have spread COVID misinformation and promoted unproven treatments such as the use of hydrochloroquine, which can be lethal to humans. Promoting it as a viable option even after scientists said not to is the exact opposite of using evidence-based science. It sounds more like they just want to do what they want to do, and they don't want anyone stopping them. Pages 284 and 285 in Project 2025 state that the NIH uses aborted body parts for human-animal experiments, suggesting that was the cause for COVID-19. However, this is another exaggeration and shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the experiments. They know that this paints a picture in people's minds of Frankenstein creatures or man-bear-pig hybrids walking around terrorizing the public. But that's not what's happening. Sometimes scientists inject human cells into lab rats. And that's because they need to see how the disease would develop within a living organism, not just in a petri dish. And these experiments are nowhere near as dramatic or like playing God as they would like to have you presume. Page 283 also claims that Medicare and Medicaid are the core of our deficit problems because so much of the budget is spent on these programs. However, Medicaid is what allows low-income individuals and families to obtain the health care they need. And Medicare is what allows the elderly and disabled to obtain the care they need. These programs are basically helping provide healthcare to marginalized communities. And those communities typically have more medical needs and fewer means to obtain them. For example, autistics have an 85% unemployment and underemployment rate. How can we get the care we need without any way of paying for it? So that's where Medicare comes in. Defunding these programs or siphoning away some of the funds could be detrimental to millions of people who rely on them. And when communities choose to only ensure the health of some people in the community, it puts the entire community at risk. Such a stance is not only discriminatory to those of us in marginalized communities, but it's a danger to all of us in the long run. In the same area of Project 2025, they say the NIH is pushing junk gender science and says the next HHS secretary should put an end to their woke transgender activism. They go further to say that HHS and Biden focused on LGBTQ equity by subsidizing single motherhood, disincentivizing work, and penalizing marriage. Let's break this down. The level of discrimination LGBTQ citizens face is bad enough to warrant protection under the law. Those protections are intended to extend the rights and privileges straight people enjoy to the LGBTQ community. In no way does it help marginalize people by taking away from the rights of others. For example, helping people obtain gender-affirming care does not infringe on the rights of others. And the fact that the Heritage Foundation believes focusing on LGBTQ issues is not as important as straight issues is just blatant discrimination. And the idea that helping people with disabilities is disincentivizing work, that's a recurring theme that's occurred throughout American history. It goes all the way back to 1941, just after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this was a controversial issue for many decades until the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which was passed just after the Vietnam War. And yet, they used the Rehabilitation Act throughout Project 2025 to rationalize their efforts to prevent abortion, to seat political appointees in government positions, and to claim housing funds for themselves. Essentially, they're leveraging disability legislation to pursue their political agenda. You can find examples of this on pages 474, 505, 506, and 584. There's so much more in this Project 2025 document, including expanding disability benefits for the VA while reducing costs to seemingly conflicting decisions, and reforming the Department of Education, which does come with a lot of impacts to disabled children and their families. But those are separate from the reforms they have in mind for the HHS, so that'll have to wait for another video. If RFK is going to be in charge of public health, it's important to know where he stands on health issues. We've talked about his views on fluoride in the water supply and his reputation of being an anti-vaxxer. But if he's saying he won't take away any vaccines, how did he get that reputation? Back in 2005, he wrote an article for Rolling Stone magazine titled "Deadly Immunity," which claimed vaccines cause autism. The article was retracted, but by that point the damage had already been done. Other news outlets like the Huffington Post, Salon, Fox and Friends, and CBS News took the story and just ran with it, claiming that ADD and autism can be caused by mercury in vaccines, and that it played a role in the autism epidemic of the 1990s. And then celebrity personalities such as Jenny McCarthy and Donald Trump, as well as politicians like Ron DeSantis, took that information and promoted them on their own platforms. Now, in 2008, journalists were able to trace these conspiracies all the way back to Andrew Wakefield, a former researcher at Thoughtful House, who claimed British children were suffering autism after exposure to the MMR vaccine. And RFK Jr. not only continued to spread the lies about autism and vaccines, but took this rhetoric to heart when he was visiting American Samoa in 2018. And that resulted in one of the worst measles outbreaks in recent memory. And in 2021, RFK Jr. falsely called the COVID-19 vaccine the deadliest vaccine ever made, falsely citing deaths from unverified sources. Again, the link between autism and vaccines is a claim that has been thoroughly debunked time and again. But not enough attention gets paid to the fact that underneath all of that lies a layer of disdain for autism. And autistic people are already marginalized. We're fighting a level of stigma most people can't even fathom. We don't need anyone spreading lies about us, especially when those lies undermine efforts to control deadly viruses. But besides all of that, just imagine giving a man who believes in such nonsense control over the CDC, which is the agency responsible for communicating the efficacy of vaccines. It's just wild. The point is, appointing someone like RFK Jr. to the office of Health Secretary would be a mistake, especially if he plans to implement the suggestions outlined in Project 2025. Luckily, appointments to major cabinet positions require approval by Congress, and with such a close split, it will be difficult to convince the majority to officially approve him for that position. However, it's not beyond impossible. And in the past, Trump has circumvented congressional approval by appointing acting officials, allowing him to unofficially place people where he wants them. Furthermore, there's already been reports of Trump demanding that the Senate allow him to appoint officials to his new administration without confirmation hearings. So this is still a huge risk that should not be ignored. I don't want to leave you hanging on a bad note, but the only way we are going to see any positive change and preserve our rights is by educating ourselves and others in our vicinity. That's why I'm starting a new playlist called Politistics. As I work on addressing some of the political issues that affect the autistic community, I'll be posting videos in that playlist. Meanwhile, please consider contributing to advocacy groups that are working on issues you care about. If you can't afford to donate money, consider donating your time or energy to help. And don't let people in your families or social circles get away with spewing falsehoods and conspiracy theories that ultimately risk the health of our communities. Take what you've learned in this video, do some additional research of your own, and use that knowledge to educate the people around you. Links to all of my resources are in the description below. Together, I hope we can make a positive difference, maybe change some hearts to be more accepting, and to embrace the realities of the times we live in, because it's going to take a lot of work to turn this boat around. I hope you'll join me in that effort. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please comment, like, and subscribe to see more content like this, or click the video here to continue watching.